impetus and enthusiasm for the process. So how do we start this project or this process? There are a couple of things that you really need to think about. And I think the first, and we'll talk a little bit in detail about each of these, is assessing the external environment. If you're a community service organization or an arts organization, your constituent group, your pool, is probably going to be local. And so you need to have an understanding of the dynamics around you. Who else is running a campaign and what size are they? Do you have an understanding or a sense of the overlap in top prospects? Who's in the philanthropic community and where are they involved? Are there political or other policy issues external to your organization that you need to be mindful of? Many of our hospitals and medical centers today are grappling with the very real changes that are occurring in government funding and Medicare and Medicaid, and this is really changing the way they're going to operate in a very fundamental way. So then you really answer those questions, and again, answer them to the extent to which you're comfortable that you have a good assessment. So, we often hear the phrase, analysis leads to paralysis. We don't want to do that, but again, we want to be, fully confident that we understand where we are in our external environment. And then we want to look internally, and we're going to talk a bit in greater detail there. We want to analyze our current development activities. My colleague Marcy often tells me, we need to know where we are in order to know where we're going. And we want to establish goals, and goals are a good thing. There are some of us who like to make lists and check them off. In many ways, that is a goal-setting process. We want to be able to evaluate our work. Are we achieving our goals? Are we advancing the institution and really getting some real work done, both in a short-term and a long-term position? And then looking at objectives, strategies, and tactics. And again, we're going to be talking a little bit about each of those. So I've mentioned a bit about the external environment. What are the campaigns? Is your brand clear and well recognized? Again, there are often organizations in a community that are similar or perhaps are in the minds of constituents lumped into one bucket: social service agencies, arts organizations, higher education, all those things. But do people understand your niche and why your organization is important to that community? And what does the public think about you? Do they see you as effective? Do they see you as using your philanthropic dollars well? So all those questions, again, you have to begin to understand those things. The economy is certainly a factor. We know that nationally, economies vary across the United States. Some cities and states are doing somewhat better than others. And so you do have to have an acknowledgement of the circumstances in your immediate area, but do not let that dictate your ambitions. There may take you longer, may take different kinds of strategies, but if your work is important enough to justify the existence of your organization, then you need to stay the course and find a way to get your work done. As I mentioned, public policy issues, is there legislation, other kinds of things that are going to be affecting your work, you need to be aware of that. Are your services sought after? Are your members growing? Are they renewing? Are they coming back year after year? Do you have additional ticket buyers? How well are those different series doing? Patients, is your patient flow the way you want it to be and maximizing your revenue? And who is your competition? Again, I mentioned earlier, in a community, often there are the well-known philanthropists, the people that everyone goes to, or the companies and foundations. So who are those folks? Where do they invest their philanthropic dollars? And are there other people, are there other potential donors that you need to be looking at? So moving on to the internal environment, you have to ask very hard questions of your organization so that you can effectively plan and galvanize the right sort of resources and programs to meet your objectives. So what is the current role of the board of directors, trustees, governors, whatever the nomenclature is? What are their roles and responsibilities? What are the expectations for that group? Are they fulfilling those expectations? Do you need to institute a review of how the board functions? Maybe a self-study, something that certain board members agree needs to be done. But you really need to understand, again, because they are among your toolbox or your assets. Same for the executive director, president, CEO, your senior leadership of the institution. Are they willing to devote the kind of time, attention, and thoughtfulness that is required? Do they have the right skill set? And that's always a sensitive issue. But we want to make sure that what we expect of our leadership is something they understand how to do and understand what their involvement really means. Development staff, are these mature, experienced folks? Do you have a mix of more mature, and I don't mean age-wise, but just folks who are experienced in the field, along with more junior folks who are really building their expertise? How does that mix affect your ability to move forward? Does it require training, et cetera? We've talked a little bit about strategic planning. Is there a plan? Has it yielded priorities that you can actually work with in terms of philanthropy? How do you position those priorities within your programming and messaging? What's the philanthropic culture of the organization? Is your institution a place that appreciates the role philanthropy can play and that it is a value-added component to what we do? Or is it really, well, it's kind of there. We're supposed to have a development office, but they never raise any money, so we're not really going to pay very much attention to them. It runs the gamut. So again, this is always something we can change. We can, again, by ongoing discussions, presentations, as you begin to talk about individual prospects, you begin to instill that appreciation for the importance that these donors play in the organization. Again, finance and budgets, programs and services, volunteer structures. Many of us, and we know we want to involve our volunteers, individuals as volunteers, because we know that volunteers give more often and often give more money. But we want to make sure we understand what we're asking our volunteers to do. We have to define that on the front end. We have to make sure they understand that that's what's expected of them and make sure they're comfortable with that. And then we also have to ask very hard questions about whether or not you have sufficient staff and other kinds of resources to support a volunteer organization. We often just think more is better. But if a volunteer becomes involved with your organization and they don't have a positive experience, that's a very hard thing to overcome. So what do we want them to do? Do they understand that, and are they comfortable with fulfilling those roles, and can we support them effectively? And then technical resources, again, just do we have the mechanisms, not just the equipment, the laptops and the computers and that kind of thing, but are our systems set up technically so that we are as efficient as possible? So we talked again, I'm on slide 9 now, talking a little bit about assessing the internal environment, including that strategic plan. And as I've mentioned before, are there specific organizational goals that are identified? with some level of specificity that will help you articulate how we're going to get from point A to point B. It's great to have an aspirational goal, but folks are going to ask you, well, exactly how are you going to get there? What's it going to take? Over what time period? Are the goals measurable? And again, is there a timeline? Is it just sort of an unlimited horizon, or do you have very specific benchmarks and milestones by which you're going to evaluate your progress? And again, do you have the sufficient resources to get the job done? It may be that you have to say, we're going to do this over time. We're going to have to take a more incremental steps than more broader steps. And that's okay if that's what's dictated by your available resources. And then how is philanthropy positioned within the strategic plan? Is it an afterthought? Is it a plug number? Or is it something that's fully integrated into your overall financial model? Is it right up there if you're a higher education institution with tuition and auxiliary services, research grants? If you're an arts organization, is it positioned along with ticket sales and memberships and grants? Does your organization recognize the fact that this can be a growing and more important revenue stream for your organization? Another useful tool is benchmarking. To take a look at both your peers and your aspirational peers. To say, gee, here's what we want to achieve. We know that the botanical garden over here has done these kinds of things, which we'd like to do as well. Let's take a look at how they did that and reach out to them to find out if they would be willing to share that information with us. What does their budget look like? Staff, what are the kinds of programs? So that you can begin to think about what might it take to get where we want to go. And we find in working with our clients that institutions are very happy to share that kind of information.
And I'll just chime in here, Lori. We'd also encourage, if you're not at a level where you feel like you want to ask your peers or your aspirant peers to share that information with you, look at their publicly available documents. Take a look at their annual reports, which will show you their financial statements and the number of donors they have. Look at guidestar.org and look at their historical 990s and the places that they're getting funding. There are lots of ways to benchmark that you can do internally with publicly available information as well.
So thank you, Marcy. It is true that many of our organizations have banded together through their professional groups and published information. We all are familiar, many of us are familiar with CAE data, AAMC data. There are other ways to gather that. Also, frankly, just combing through their websites often yields a lot of information. Some final comments on the internal environment. Again, taking a look at where you've been over the recent past. 5 years is perfectly fine. If you go much farther back than that, it begins to get a little bit dated and it loses its relevancy. But to look at by gift level and gift vehicle, what have you been doing over the last 5 years? Are there trends? Are there patterns? Can you link a spike in support to some specific event? But again, understanding where you've been in a pretty detailed level. What are the historical sources of your gifts? Are they individuals? And what makes up those individuals? Again, ticket buyers, members, patients, alumni, parents. What is the constituent type or profile so that you can begin to understand or begin targeting others who look like them for support? And then, of course, things like corporations and foundations and your board. So, Marcy, I think I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Absolutely. Lori's given you all a fantastic background on the importance of strategic planning for fundraising in your organizations and institutions and some of the key pieces that you'll put into that plan. And now we want to give you an overview on how you can start the planning process, create that plan, and implement it as well. We've outlined here some key steps that you'll need to take within your development teams and with your key stakeholders to implement a strategic planning process for fundraising specifically. First and foremost, this is the time, as Lori said before, for your fundraising teams to answer many of the important questions and truly take stock of where you are in your organization's evolution and where you are in your fundraising efforts. These can often be very difficult questions to answer, but it's important to take the time here and really examine where you are today, where you want to go, and what will it take to get you there. It might mean admitting that you're lacking in some resources or forcing some conversations about what's needed for your organization to go to the next level in fundraising. And it may also mean admitting weaknesses that may have previously been swept under the rug. These are important questions to answer and sometimes very difficult ones. Next, it's important to determine the key priorities in your plan. It's easy for us as fundraisers to come up with a laundry list of wishes for our programming, pages and pages long that we can throw on our websites and say everything that we wish we had. But the strategic planning process will really force you to prioritize that list. Which priorities will they be, and which will, without a doubt, drive you to the next level? Which will get you to that place, if you'd answer that question, where you really want to go. It's important too, point 3, that you organize the planning process to be inclusive. You can't do this in a vacuum with just your development staff or just the director of development and your executive director. You have to get your key stakeholders involved. Your board members should have critical input, and perhaps even key donors, individual donors, foundation, maybe corporate donors. Take the time to get them involved in the process and listen to their input, because they are really the people who will help you get to that next level in fundraising. Next, we want to make sure that you're honest with yourself again about what resources you need, what programs and time requirements you'll need to achieve the goals you're setting. As Lori said, a 5-year plan is a normal timeline. I think especially in small organizations, we have a tendency to try to get it all done in the next 365 days. But true change and growth and implementation takes the time and dedication of often years of an implementation plan. Number 5, be sure to establish places in the planning process and implementation to evaluate your progress. GG&A has 50 years of campaign planning experience, and all of our consultants will tell you that there are times when a client's campaign hits a wall. Gifts slow down and momentum is hard to pick back up, and these are really the times that if you build in those evaluation points where you can evaluate your progress, change the course if necessary, and really remotivate your team to be successful in implementing the plan. And finally, we find it incredibly important for you to gather the approval from your leadership team, your board, your executive director, key donors in your organization, so that you'll be ready to implement that plan. One of the most important pieces in strategic planning, and I know Lori said I harp on this a little, and I do, is knowing who you are, having a clear sense of institutionally who you are, and in a fundraising and a philanthropic sense, knowing your strengths philanthropically and knowing your strengths organizationally, which might be different strengths and different weaknesses. Do you know, for instance, which programs appeal most to your donors? Which programs are most fundable, if you will? Again, admit the challenge you're facing and clearly articulate the goals you've set, as well as your strategies and tactics to achieve them. The plan should reference throughout an examination of who you are, like Lori said, an analysis of your past giving, trends over the 3 to 5 years that you're looking at, and industry benchmarks if they're available and appropriate. Finally, we want you to ensure that your goals that you're setting are realistic, but also ambitious enough to give your staff and stakeholders a goal they can really sink their teeth into. That realistic is great, but realistically ambitious is better. So we want to give you some guidelines about goal setting specifically. Again, you want to think realistically and what you can do, but you also want to be very calculated in thinking about goals that are a stretch for you. Think about goals that are already a part of your organization's identity, and think about goals that are related perhaps to your vision statements and your value statements as well, to match up to the fundraising success you've already had. You want to make sure that you're identifying goals that philanthropy can best support. Hopefully, your organizations have multiple revenue streams and not just philanthropic revenue streams. So when you're planning, take into consideration which goals fit best with philanthropic revenue streams. Paying the light bill may not be the best goal to meet with philanthropic funds. It might need another revenue stream to go along with it. But building a new program that sets out to double your service numbers or increase your reach in the community might be a better fit for some of those philanthropic funds. And again, we can't say this enough. You need to realistically examine the challenges and limitations you face and address head-on with your board, with your leadership, the ways that you plan to overcome those challenges. Know what you'll need to have in human resources. Know what you'll need to have in dollar goals and in programming to meet those goals. And finally, again, we can't say this enough, organize your planning with clear intervals for evaluation, perhaps at 1, 3, and 5-year marks.
And let me just add there, if I may, Marcy, in all of the goal setting that we're talking about here for your fundraising program, you need to be able to demonstrate to your potential donors how the fundraising goals are supporting the strategic goals of the organization. They can't run parallel and they can't run in divergent directions. You're a sophisticated, experienced philanthropist is going to ask questions about, if I make this investment here, how is that going to help the organization achieve its long-term goals? So that's why we talk so much about really a collaborative approach institutionally to planning, so that you have around the table the program folks that are responsible for instituting the program, the finance folks who are charged with managing the resources, the financial resources, as well as leadership and the fundraising group, because it best works when it's all collaborative and fully integrated.
Absolutely. Lori is entirely right on that, and it's something that we say a lot here at GG&A, and actually one of the, I hope you won't mind that I plug, one of the webinars in this series is called Everyone's a Fundraiser, and Lori's exactly right. From your finance people to your program individuals to fundraisers and the executive director, everyone needs to be involved. So when Lori and I were planning this webinar, we wanted to make sure that we set out some definitions for you as well, because I think one of the things that we realized is that many of us talk about what is a goal versus an objective and what is a strategy versus a tactic. So I want to look through this list that we've put together, and I would encourage you as you're planning, as you're creating your fundraising plans, to come back to this definition list to make sure that you're clearly identifying that goals are really those larger purpose, often institutional-wide goals that cross departmental lines. Where are you going? Objectives are the next step down. They're quantifiable and spell out what should be done when you're addressing those larger institution-wide goals. Breaking it down a little bit more, strategies are another step down in the planning process and often represent an individual program or something specific that you're looking of how that portion of an objective will be achieved. Even further, you've got to keep moving on tactics. What are the day-to-day actions, things that you're going to do weekly that will support the strategies and delineate who's doing what, when? Your staff, your board, your donors, who's going to be involved at that hands-on level. Finally, we want to make sure that you have timetables that specify when you plan to have these goals achieved and the clear evaluation that you'll do at the year end and at the end of each maybe 1, 3, or 5-year goal. I'll now turn it over to Lori. We've got some great sample tools to talk to you about, things that we think are good looks at what you need to do in order to start the process.
Yeah, so thanks. So first of all, what the heck was I talking about when I said look at your giving by gift level and by constituency? So we have a report here. We have a table that is data from one of our client relationships where we're looking again at how well they've done securing gifts at various gift levels over the last 5 years. And what this tells us is they have some experience in securing $1 million and greater commitments but it's sort of sporadic, and it really hasn't been growing. And you see that same pattern as you go down the gift table. So this suggests that perhaps we need to have additional naming opportunities or projects at the higher level that we can talk with folks, and that it's a sequence or multiple options there. What kinds of conversations are we having with, for instance, these 5 or 6 donors that are presented here at the very top? If you look farther down, we see that the trend stabilizes just a little bit at the lower gift levels, so that suggests perhaps programming has taken hold. There are a more consistent level of resources applied here. So you know, again, this begins to give you a snapshot of trend, and if you can tie this back to specific programming initiatives over time, you know, perhaps there was a challenge grant, or perhaps there was a momentum toward building a program, and lots of resources were driven toward doing that over, let's say, fiscal year 7 and 8. That's very helpful, and that's why our historical records and things like coding, I don't want to get too far in the weeds here, but coding of records and coding of appeals is important, because you can begin to look at how did that happen. Trends in donors. This table came from a membership organization, obviously looking at how many donors/members have we had over time, and you can see that they were looking at 4 groups: council members, which was sort of a leadership group, other individuals, foundations, and then corporations. And you can see, by and large, the council, foundation, and corporate donor numbers have remained relatively stable. And they've had some growth over time with those other individuals which represented memberships. And so I'm also looking at this, seeing, well, 2002, they definitely had a growth spurt there between 2002 and 3. What prompted that was a big push. We actually see the giving by foundations grew a little bit as a percentage. And then there was another growth spurt at the end of between 2005 and 2006. So again, this tells us something. We want to go back and look at the programming and see what did we learn from that, and can we replicate it. By source, again, now we're looking at dollars from the same group. And the good news here is they were seeing significant growth in almost every level, with the exception of, well, no, I guess everything. I'm not sure why the total doesn't grow as much. But we're beginning to look at some consistent levels of solicitation, growth across all levels. They particularly had a spike with foundations in that 2004 year, so you could make up a story around a specific grant that was awarded, perhaps for a new program, you know, a new facility, something along those lines. The gift table is a really interesting tool that you almost want to keep right next to your computer on your desk, because you can use it to do a variety of things. It's certainly an educational tool for perhaps administrative leadership or volunteer leadership to say, look, this is what it's going to take to achieve a $35 million goal over, say, a 5 or 7 year period. You know, best practice would say you want to have a lead gift at the $5 million level. Who do we have among our constituent group that has that capacity? And best practice, again, would say we need to have at least 3 of those type of prospective donors in order to have a reasonable level of expectation that we could secure a gift like that. So it's an educational tool from that perspective. It's also a tool by which you can evaluate progress in building your prospect pool. And so You can see that column there in the middle, number of private gift prospects needed. You could actually add another column to say number of prospects identified, and it becomes a management tool and a tool to evaluate progress and how well we're identifying and engaging with those prospective donors who are going to help us achieve our goal. This is again, another view of our prospects, and this is organized now by staff member who has assignments and by gift level. Now, when I first saw this, my immediate thought was, gee, this particular organization needs to do some work at the higher levels of the gift table. Their prospect distribution is really at the low end for this particular organization, and they also have a good percentage of these prospects who are yet to be qualified. So this tells us where right now we need to spend our time. We need to get those prospects qualified, and that could be a goal for an organization for a year. We're going to make sure that all 155 of those prospective donors have been seen and qualified. Are they on the list, or are they going to be coming off the list because they just don't have the interest, or maybe, just don't have the capacity? Also, it begs the question, what is our definition of a major gift? And in this particular case of this organization, a major gift is $25,000 and higher. So I have to ask the question, why do we have 100, almost 20% of the assigned prospects rated below that? Do we need to ask some questions about whether these are the right folks to be assigned to our development officers? But it certainly lays out for an organization that we need to be focusing and identifying those prospects at the top of the gift pyramid.
Thanks so much, Lori. Lori's just given you all some phenomenal tools to assess your current situation, but another question you want to ask yourself is, do we want to grow? And if so, how much? This table that we're looking at is actually a recent client of GG&A that's a small nonprofit. So if you're in a small nonprofit, these numbers might look a little more realistic to you than some of the $35 million and $100 million goals that we've seen. This organization had an average budget over the last 4 years of about $2 million a year, and their board came to us and set a very ambitious 5-year growth goal to double the size of the organization by 2016. As you'll look here, we gave them a growth scenario that would bring them to that $4 million that included increasing their gifts by their trustees, perhaps increasing the size of their board, significantly increasing their individual donors and relying much less on foundation funding, significantly increasing corporate donors and event donors as well. You'll notice here, and I want to point this out because it's really important as a development department, especially if you're in the small shop, to think about the investment that's been made in the development staff. For this organization, in the last year, they made a huge investment in development staff. So we weren't recommending that over the next 5 years that they change that investment very much. But it might be for your organization that in order to get to the next level, you need to heavily invest in development of personnel or in development program expenditures to make sure that you have the human resources, the technical resources to back up your growth plan all along. Often it's the pushback that fundraisers will get from board members. Can you grow what you're doing without growing your staff? And the answer to that is usually no. You need to make an investment in development in order to grow and change what you're looking at for your organizational development. The next chart is from the same client, and this is something, as you're looking at growth, we'd encourage you very heavily to look at your mix of fundraising. Lori showed you this a couple of slides back. Are you getting more corporate donors than you are individual donors? For this organization, they've relied over the past 4 years, almost 90% of their fundraising came from foundations. So of course, we encourage them to shrink their foundation dependence, to increase their corporate donorship, They had some very strict corporate giving guidelines that we advised them to eliminate. And I think that this is something that you should look at. What are the percentages in individual donors that you want to get to? What percentage of those individual donors do you want to come from your board? And that takes some real leadership to determine whether or not you should recruit more high wealth people, if you should, like Lori said, move some of those people to the major gift realm, and think about whether or not they're the right people to be in your prospect pool.
And let me just add also, this diversification of your support, your base of support, is important. True story, a community hospital that I did a little bit of work with had a wonderful philanthropist, an older woman, who gave them $1 million a year, almost unsolicited. It was just a regular course of her philanthropy. Unfortunately, she grew aged and passed away, and suddenly they were missing $1 million, which was almost half of their philanthropic support every year, and they had nothing to replace it with. So it's important that you are not overly dependent on either one type of donor or one donor or a small handful of donors, that you're always looking, again, at the diversification in your planning. And that's where this analysis of past giving can help you reveal where you may be vulnerable.
Absolutely. So as we wrap our presentation today, and I want to encourage you all, now's the time to submit your questions to Catherine, and she will ensure we get to them at the end of this presentation. But as we wrap, we wanted to share with you some clear goals that were set by one of our clients to give you an example of a best practice in this goal and strategy setting. Notice here the clarity in the goals, and that they have sort of expanded on the challenges to say, in order to pursue the Foundation's mission and vision, we strive to make significant progress in a number of areas. By achieving the goals set forth in the strategic plan, we will continue to build on current success and overcome impediments. Now, this is sort of a blanket statement goal, and what they did that was really fantastic was broke them down into additional sample goals that were much more measurable and that would take them to the right level in their fundraising. So I want to show you the next slide, which were some of their sample goals. For instance, to increase unrestricted annual fund by a minimum of 35% by approximately $250,000 to $340,000. This is very clearly measurable. They know exactly where they want to go, and they can put in place strategies and tactics to get them there. So these are the type of goals that, as you're in your process, we would encourage you to come back and look at. Are they mocking these kinds of goals? Are you going towards the measurable side of things and making sure that you can come back to them and evaluate them month after month and year after year as they sit next to you on your desk every day? We'll now turn it over to you all for questions. Catherine, do we see some coming in already?
We do. A lot of people want to know if this PowerPoint presentation will be available for download.
Absolutely. All of you will receive an email following this presentation that will include a copy of the PowerPoint and also a recording of this session.
Another question was asked, how can you ensure that your stretch goals are realistic enough to be achievable?
Well, I would, boy, that's a great question. I think if you ever get to know me, you'll know that I will always say, what are the prospects telling you? And within the context of that, what has been your trend? Are you fairly consistent in year to year, your ability year to year to increase incrementally? Are you stable in your donor pool? Do your priorities inspire individuals? And that's where you really have to engage folks in conversations. Where is your prospect base and how is it distributed? When I say where, I mean, what is its maturity? Do you know folks? Do you have a pipeline of prospects, in other words, from identification all the way through stewardship? Are there individuals, are there donors that perhaps can be resolicited. They've completed their commitment, they've been recognized and been stewarded, and perhaps now is the time to begin to talk to them. So it's a multifaceted question where you have to look at where have we been, what are the institutional goals, and what is that going to take, and how can philanthropy contribute to it? Again, looking at your data, what's been our history. We looked at one slide where one of the organizations we looked at where they had a somewhat consistent base of $1 million gifts, growing at the lower level. Do we have individuals or other kinds of prospective donors who are approaching that point where we can solicit them, and can we begin to have pre-solicitation conversations? So, and I actually have run across this where a CEO might say, well, I want to double philanthropy next year. Well, that's just not a realistic goal, and that's where your data and the process of educating leadership in an appropriate manner is so important, because going from $1 million a year to $2 million a year, or from $50 million a year to $100 million a year, is just not a realistic goal. However, if you want to say, in one of the earlier slides, a 35% increase in the annual fund, that's a pretty ambitious goal, and I would hope that institution had some data to back that up. So, Marcy, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but it is a very tricky question, but again, going back to your data, how well do you know your program? How well do you know your prospects? How ready are they? And then do you have the programmatic components to make that happen?
I think you're absolutely right, Lori. Another important thing in growth, and this goes back to examining your last 3 or 5 years. With the client that we were looking at in their growth scenarios before, we saw that actually looking over 4 years back, that in 2006 and 2007, they had a huge growth phase, and we asked them, what was that about? And it turns out that in that year, they had done their 25th anniversary flagship fundraiser. They had an incredible number of people turn out for this gala, a number of corporate sponsorships, and didn't continue to do an event like that for the next few years. One of our recommendations to them was to look at the way their fundraising grew in the year that they did that kind of engagement, and to think about doing that in upcoming years to continue to grow their fundraising. There are lots of ways as you look back to think about the years where you did really well, or the years where you grew. And when you're setting those goals, look at those growth years and think about what's realistic, not just today, but what's been realistic in your best year over the last 5 years as well. Catherine, do we have other questions?
Yeah, Marcy, we do have another question. Someone asked, how do you manage expectations of trustees without coming across as being conservative or negative? How do you educate trustees to invest more in personnel?
That's a terrific question, and something that GG&A, with all of our clients, works with their board of trustees, boards of regents, to manage expectations, just like you said. We would encourage you to do some very specific board training, and actually one of our last webinar in this series will be very specifically about board best practices. But to get you started on that, be realistic with your board about what fundraising looks like. They may not know the things you think they do. They may not know what their responsibilities are. I would encourage you to spell out in documentation to your board when someone joins your board what is expected of them. Go so far as to say what perhaps their give or get is, so that they're realistically informed of what their responsibilities are as board members, and that they're realistically informed of what you're doing every day. These kinds of charts that we showed you as the sample tools are great charts to present to your board members, to show them where you've been the last few years, and to give them the empirical evidence of where you want to go.
Yeah, and I would add, anytime, well, I shouldn't say anytime, you should have as a goal to engage your leadership, particularly trustees, in ongoing conversations about development. And that can be even as basic as reviewing a list, talking through with them why they think someone has the capacity to make a gift, talking with them about their own contributions and ways they might make future gifts, and frankly, if you involve them directly in conversations with other prospective donors, it helps them begin to learn that, gee, this isn't quite as easy as I thought it was going to be. So it is, I agree with Marcy, I think sharing information, helping them understand the process, that this is not, it's not, I always talk about development is not like a light switch or a faucet. You don't just turn it on or off. It is a process of relationship building, trust building, providing realistic and honest information. I think often when boards get nervous and when CEOs get nervous, it's when they don't know that they have all the information. And so sometimes we have to deliver unhappy news. And as you build a track record of success, your credibility increases, the trust grows, and then you can have more fundamental conversations or more honest conversations with your boards.
Absolutely. We have some phenomenal questions coming in, and we're going to do our best over the next few days to answer all of them and send you all a follow-up to all of those questions. But we're just finishing up here, so I want to wrap up our conversation as well. Thank you all for attending. It's been wonderful to share this information with you, and we hope you've gotten a lot out of it. As Catherine said at the beginning, you will all get a copy of this PowerPoint presentation and the recording today, followed up by a survey, and we will absolutely be answering every single question submitted. We do encourage you all, we're going to leave the application open for the next 15 or 20 minutes. Ask more questions. We will absolutely respond to all of them. Going forward, though, I want you all, as I said at the beginning, to mark your calendars for our next webinar, which is 3 weeks from today at the same time, Thursday, February 4th. And this webinar is called Stating Your Case. We're going to talk a lot about the communications of your fundraising plan, how you bring together all of your communications pieces to make sure they're consistent across the board and do what you want them to do. So if you're going to attend that, we would recommend in the next few weeks, take some time to look at your current communications pieces. Do they say accurately who you are and what you do? Are they consistent across the board? And do they match the goals we're talking about today in your strategic plan? And then, of course, as we encourage you always to benchmark, look at the communication of your peers. Look at what they're sending out via email, what they're doing on social media, and take some of that into account so you have it in the back of your mind when you join myself and another vice president here at GGNA, Ed Karen, 3 weeks from today on February 4th. So with that, we'll sign off, and on behalf of Lori and the entire team at GGNA, I thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again in a few weeks.